Does anyone remember that Robin Hood TV show that the BBC made in the 2000s? You know, the one where they went, oh shit, this new version of Doctor Who has been wildly successful, we need something to go on Saturday night TV for some of the rest of the year when it's not on, and threw something at the wall to see if it stuck. I don't remember much about it, mostly that basically every episode was some variation of one of the gang has been captured and imprisoned in the castle, the rest of the gang heroically rescued him and leave the Sheriff of Nottingham angrily waving his fist a bit like Homer at the end of the Indiana Jones bit of The Simpsons, but while in keeping in the spirit of the legend, I can't imagine it made the terribly gripping television after the first 3 or 4 times, and it ended up being canned by the BBC before David Tennant had left the TARDIS. While it would be unwise for Doctor Who fans to throw stones from our cancellation glass house at the moment, you know, with all that's happened, I also can't imagine its passing was particularly mourned. I think this speaks to 2 phenomena personally myself. Firstly, the Doctor Who was indeed something special that the audience really latched onto, and the fate if most if not all of the Doctor Who alights that the late noughties produced in droves from both Auntie and the other lot speaks to this. The Doctor Who really is in a league of its own for its ability to draw the audiences in, which I think is a broadly good sign for whenever the show may return again. I could speak to why this is, but I won't, because it's a broad topic I can talk about any time, and having done several long reviews in a row, I want this to be a short one. Secondly, and more pertinently for the subject of this review, I think it demonstrated that nobody is really interested in Robin Hood. It's a fun folktale and undemanding goodies versus baddies stories that you can tell to kids, and that one of most of its famous adaptations is by Disney demonstrates that aptly. While telling us that greed and corruption are bad, while heroism and selflessness are good, it's a fairy tale really, and that's fine, but I'm just not sure this can really lend itself to any more than that. Trying to make drama out of it just feels like a waste of time, trying to make the drama out of, I don't know, something like The Princess and the Pea. Modern interpretations try to make Robin more complex, but he's still at the end of the day an uncomplicated swashbuckling hero and the Sheriff of Nottingham a moustache-twirling villain. And again, that's fine for an uncomplicated fairy tale. The most memorable thing about that Robin Hood film from the 90s with Kevin Costner was Alan Rickman's scenery-chewing performance. But to make proper drama, you need complicated heroes and complicated villains, and character arcs and progression and themes and all that. And I don't think this particular tale in any way lends itself to that. So if you can't do drama, can you do comedy? Well, there might be a bit more leeway there. The other Robin Hood film of the 90s was a Mel Brooks comedy, but I think you run into roadblocks here as well, because to make it work, you have to loosen everyone from their roles in the fairy tale. Both hero and villain have to become buffoons to make it work. Easy for the villain, less so to take a beloved folk hero and turn him into a prick. Mel Brooks could pull it off, and even then it's hardly one of his more beloved movies. I'm not sure Doctor Who can. Which brings us to Robot of Sherwood. The third episode of Series 8, and thus the Capaldi era, it comes after a deeply unimpressive opening episode and not much better Dalek yarn, so this is the first comedy episode of the era. Alarm bells are already ringing, because the Moffat era and comedy do not have the best track record, and while Peter Capaldi is a talented comedic performer, his most famous role prior to Doctor Who was in the comedy series, let's not forget, he is much more suited to the dry black comedy, as you might expect from Armando Iannucci, than wacky and goofy that tends to be NuWho's first and only approach. Add in that we're tackling Robin Hood at the same time, and the concept does not exactly inspire confidence. But are the results any good? Well, I can honestly say that I was surprised, because it turned out the episodes was actually even worse than I remembered. It's absolutely dreadful. The plot might be absolutely stupid, the characters are all annoying, and it is Exhibit A and why Clara infuriates me so much, but at least it makes up for it by being so hideously unfunny that I just felt embarrassed for everyone involved, other than Mrs. Gatiss, the actual writer, and Moffat, the one who no doubt came up with the brilliant concepts, because, well, I'm just kind of beyond feeling embarrassment for them at this point, and after all, it was all their idea. If you want to know why the ratings and relevance decline that eventually doomed Doctor Who started in the Moffat era, Exhibit A, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. On first broadcast, nearly 12 goddamn years ago, if you want to feel as ancient as I do now, I remember thinking it was at least funny bad, but honestly in this watch I didn't even get that. The attempts at comedy are so absolutely pathetic that their unfunniness means I can't even find the failure of anything else funny. It's just a complete mess. But how does it handle Robin Hood? Badly. See, Gatiss has written himself into a corner here. Because this is meant to be a comedy, Robin has to be able to act in a comedic manner, but he has to prove himself as a hero to the Doctor and confirm Clara's view of him as one as well. He therefore has to act like the typical Robin Hood hero, so it's stuck. He can't act like a goof, now make comedy. Now maybe some clever comedy through one-liners. Well, the one-liners are certainly tried, and they're absolutely embarrassing. I could have written better ones when I was 5. Situational comedy? See above. So, what about everyone else? Surely the Sheriff of Nottingham will be a moustache-twirling goof played by a scenery-chewing actor. Well, Ben Miller is definitely chewing the scenery, alright, but for some inconceivable reason, he's written as like a dark, straight villain, and, a nasty one, a dark one. It's difficult to find comedy in him declaring he's going to force Clara to marry him, funnily enough. Which demonstrates a main problem with this episode. It has no real idea what it wants to be. It clearly aspires to comedy, but it gets all muddled up in dramatic elements too, making the sheriff into a proper villain and trying to explore Robin's self-doubts and regrets about marrying and all that, which isn't a problem necessarily on its own, but it doesn't fit with what we get in the comedy, which leads to tonal problems, I know, but far more importantly, it just comes across as surface level and shallow, like no more thought has been put into this than just, there's the concepts, there's the ideas behind it, we'll put them in exposition, that's it. All of this is demonstrated over like 3 conversations, and that does not equal character growth. If you had a full series to focus on him, maybe you could make it work, and I don't know, maybe that TV series I talked about at the start did. As I said, I don't really remember anything about it. But 2 problems arise from that. Firstly, it's not really in keeping with the spirit of the legend, which is, again, a simple fairy tale, folk tale. And secondly, and rather more importantly, you don't have a full series. You have 45 minutes of Doctor Who. You know, the one about the bloke in the police box and not the idiot with the bow and arrow? While the execution is very poor, I think this concept simply required too many trade-offs to really work, even if the execution had not been very poor. And it was very poor, in case I hadn't made that clear. Let's start looking at the production, though, and this is where most of the episode's virtues are. This was directed by Paul Murphy, someone so unknown he doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. Happily, TARDIS Wiki obliges, telling me he's mostly a TV director on stuff like Casualty, which I can't say too much about, I wouldn't watch that shit if you paid me, but it's a living, so fair play to him. His only other Who credit is The Caretaker, where his directing was a bright spot in an otherwise wretched episode, and the same definitely applies here. I think he actually does a really good job, and he's the only reason this isn't right at the bottom of the pile, to be honest. Despite the script's shortcomings, he does a magnificent job keeping things well-paced, breezy, and engaging. Despite the nonsense that's actually happening on the page, the episode never grinds to a halt or gets boring. He manages to hold the interest and keep the piece's energy. He gives it quite a large scope and feel to the piece, which almost gives a cinematic feel to it, and his shot choices are quite unique and interesting without feeling goofy or over the top as other NuWho directors frequently made their style. He wasn't going to save this crappy episode, but he does an admirable job in making it far more bearable than it otherwise would be, and it's a pity he never came back for more. I hope it wasn't because of the poor reception of his 2 episodes, because neither were in any way his fault. If there's anything good about the episode, it's probably from the directing rather than the appalling script. The rest of the production unfortunately looks quite cheap. I suspect they were trying to save money here, and while spending less on your shittier scripts is admirable budgeting, it does no favour to said shit scripts. The set design is quite weak, the location scouting no doubt found the cheapest possible castle within the drive of London, which makes Nottingham look rather smaller than it actually was, and the special effects are quite poor. The design of the robots looks okay though, so swings and roundabouts. I will say though, pretty much the only moment in the episode I actually liked was when the Doctor was looking at Robin Hood on the ship computer. An image of when Patrick Troughton had played him back on the TV series back in the day came up, and that was a nice touch, so good job to whoever made that decision. Otherwise, not much to talk about. I do have much to talk about with the script. Mark Gatiss, and I still haven't really worked out how to pronounce his name, I must before I run out of his episodes, has a bit of an up and down list of credits. Sometimes he can be decent, sometimes not, and this one definitely falls into not. I do have to admit, though, this does have Moffat's fingerprints all over it, and while I don't doubt the finished product is mostly Gatiss's in terms of the script, the concept would have been Moffat's, and I can just imagine his giddiness at the idea of doing this shitty comedy. So I will be very Robin Hood-like and share the blame out equally. Firstly, I'll go over the things I like about the script. Now that's done, let's talk about the things I don't like about it. Okay, that's a bit facetious. While there's nothing I like about it, so to speak, there are things that you might think I'm going to rant about that in fact I don't really mind. That there's no explanation for Robin being real, for instance. That's fine, it plays into the theme of the distinction between real person and legend, and helps demonstrate to the Doctor that he's the hero he wants him to think he is. Fine, in theory anyway, because in practice my problems are that this feels completely arbitrary. The reason for the Doctor even being on this in the first place is to do with his own character journey, finding himself after the regeneration and all that. It's just because, well, Clara has to be proved right, because of course she does. It also doesn't feel quite in the spirit of the legend. Robin forever defeats the sheriff and has no more adventures thanks to this other fictional character basically coming and saving the day for him. Hooray! Doesn't quite match up the theme, does it? But, as I said, Robin being real, fine. The plot as a whole, though, is just idiocy. The whole thing feels completely stretched to fit through the desired plot beats rather than progressing naturally, which would be a lot less of a problem if those plot beats weren't fucking imbecilic. So much of it just feels unnaturally shoehorned in. I cannot shake the suspicion the robots were involved at all just so we could get the title of the episode. That, or it was part of the BBC Monster mandate, which admittedly is not Moffat's fault, but they not only feel completely superfluous to the story, like they're just here to be lumbering villains and given a reason for stuff to happen at the end rather than be actually explored in themselves, generic is the word, you get the feeling that even if they were, it wouldn't really have added anything. There was supposed to be a twist at the end where the sheriff was actually a cyborg the whole time, to which I can only ask, why? What would the point in that have been? What would it have said about his character or his place as the villain in Robin's story, or indeed the robots themselves? We're frankly better off as we are. At least the episode can claim to be trying to show that human interaction between Robin and his nemesis. Failing, but at least trying. The cut wasn't even for story reasons. The reveal was supposed to be the sheriff being beheaded by Robin at the end of their fight, and given in 2014 ISIS were going around actually beheading a lot of people in very real and gruesome ways, this was deemed insensitive. From that point of view, it was certainly for the best, but ignoring that, I think it demonstrates a haphazard approach. Just throw it in that Sheriff of Nottingham is a cyborg. Why? Don't ask questions, just do it. Who actually cares whether it actually improves or adds anything to it? That's more or less the approach to the whole episode, really. There are 3 reasons anything in the episode is there at all. 1, to hit the expected beats from a Robin Hood story. 2, for the purposes of comedy. And 3, miscellaneous. For instance, the archery contest is number 1. Robin entering in disguise and splitting the arrow with his. It's one of the best known things about him. It's a trope everyone's going to expect. The Doctor and Robin's wacky hijinks while locked up in the cell, that's number 2. Painfully unfunny and annoying, clearly intended to get a laugh that never comes close to escaping from the lips. And then there's number 3, which is the throw shit at the wall to see what sticks option. And not very much sticks. For instance, the entire story of the robots is painfully generic and adds nothing to anything. How they need their gold that's lazily added as a plot point is confusing. It's both powering their ship, but they can't have too much of it, and apparently the addition of 1 quite small arrow is enough to tip the explosionometer from fine to kaboom. Utter nonsense. The stuff would made Marion feel shoehorned in, probably because, again, is what we expect from a Robin Hood story. Her reveal at the end is just ridiculous. I can't imagine how that conversation went. Yeah, just stand behind the blue wooden box, which will disappear, and then you can have a dramatic and sudden reveal to Robin. It's just absolutely ridiculous. The central theme of the episode is extremely confused. There's the idea that the Doctor doesn't believe in Robin Hood and has to be proven to him throughout the episode that he should. To which I say, firstly, why is the Doctor being criticised for this clearly correct belief? As I already said, Robin Hood is a fairy tale with absolutely no historical basis. If Clara wanted to go and meet Snow White and the 7 Dwarves, would that have to be something the Doctor would be proved wrong on? He's basically being proved wrong in his verifiable and objective belief because the writer says so, and because it's Series 8 to make Clara look correct even when she shouldn't. And yes, I do stand by what I said, that I don't necessarily mind that Robin's realness doesn't have an explanation within the context of the story. It doesn't, however, make the fact that the Doctor is being treated like an idiot for treating a fairy tale like a fairy tale any less stupid. But even if that wasn't a problem, to what end is this? What is the Doctor learning here? What journey is he going on? It doesn't fit into his overall series arc. It just feels like he's been given this random and out-of-nowhere journey to believe impossible things because something heroes. That doesn't make him feel like he's changed or learned anything realistic or important, or indeed growth within his post-regeneration character. I don't like the series-wide arc much in Series 8, but at least it's trying to do something, anything, rather than lame progression of nothing. It's pathetic, frankly. I've seen more coherent character arcs and episodes of Thomas the Tank Engine. But of course, even these extremely limited attempts end up being all the more incoherent because comedy! See, the Doctor doesn't believe in Robin Hood, but that won't stop him sword-fighting him with a spoon, which is so incredibly stupid it just makes my brain hurt. You do realise a sword is not just a long metal thing, right? It's a heavy, sharp weapon that I have to imagine would knock a spoon out of someone's hands pretty easily. But then don't worry, this is all leading up to the big comedy moment where the Doctor knocks Robin into the river only for... uh-oh, the Doctor gets pulled in too. Ha ha ha. I'm sure it took all of Murray Gold's self-restraint not to put a wah 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 into the soundtrack. How about just make the characters shit themselves? This is the level we're going to stoop to. And then, of course, there's the archery contest scene, where the Doctor joins in and the contest escalates with increasingly ridiculous achievements, which is funny because these are a pair of self-satisfied arseholes trying and failing to prove they have the bigger penis, which is entirely accurate if you replace the word funny with infuriating. It's a pathetic take on the cliché of a tale, managing to make both our heroes look ridiculous, which is particularly impressive when that's the opposite of the point. Oh, and it turns out the Doctor is cheating, using some homing device. How he managed to pull this out of his arse to manage it is beyond me, but we don't find out this particular tidbit until the end of the episode to explain why we can't use the Doctor's newfound archery skills to save the day. No, we have to use a different arse pull for that. Surely it would have been better to find out then and there, perhaps the device malfunctions and the arrows start flying around out of control or something. I mean, I can't imagine it would have been rip-roaring hilarious, to put it mildly, but at least it would have been an attempt. Comedy and Doctor Who have a strange relationship. Of all the things Doctor Who can be, comedic is the highest risk, lowest reward. It's extremely difficult to make the series into a comedy, but even when it works, it's just not going to feel congruous. And to be honest, I struggle to think of any occasions when it succeeded on a real level, at least on TV. Well, I mean, there's stuff like Dragonfire, but unintentionally funny doesn't count. Everyone always points to City of Death as the pinnacle of comedic Who, and I adore City of Death, but it's not really a comedy. It's a standard sci-fi drama tale as you'd expect from any iteration of Doctor Who, but it just has a lot of moments with comedic wit, intelligent, well-integrated humour, moment by moment. It doesn't stop the story for irrelevant jokes. Even John Cleese and Ellen Bron treating the TARDIS as a work of modern art makes sense in the context of the story, which is still telling a proper Doctor Who story, and a very intelligent and well-crafted one. That's why the story is so beloved. Part of the issue is that Doctor Who's very nature makes this more difficult than it would be for a lot of other shows. Doctor Who has to take itself seriously, it just completely falls apart when it doesn't, and that's because its concept is inherently silly. Star Trek can get away with doing comedy episodes, because its premise is inherently serious, that of the bold and adventurous exploration of space with a realistic society of a prosperous future. Doctor Who's premise is that a space wizard is travelling in time in a blue police box. That is, on itself, just on its own, a pretty silly premise, and the suspension of this belief for the series only works when the show itself is willing to meet the audience halfway and take it just as seriously as we want to. That's why comedy is difficult to pull off, because it doesn't take much to turn the show into self-parody. And it's not as if the show hasn't spent 6 decades being a punching bag for all of its silliness. The wobbly sets and bubble wrap monsters of the classic era, the melodrama and confusing complicated storylines of NuWho. It's all been said and done over the years, and adding in the acknowledgement of that just turns the series into a farce. And again, that doesn't preclude any jokes in Doctor Who. One's based on clever, witty moments like City of Death, but even straight-up comedic laugh-out-loud moments are fine as long as they're placed and done properly. Hell, in the very next episode after this one, Listen, an entirely dramatic piece, there's the Where's Wally joke, which is genuinely funny, which is far more that can be said for a single of the non-pathetic non-jokes from this episode. But they have to be well-timed and kept in check. And also, well, not be completely fucking stupid. Another problem with NuWho's approach which tends to be whichever is the wackiest or coolest possible thing. It's spectacle over substance every time, and that's the worst possible thing to do with comedy. Because then you end up with a sword fight with a spoon as something attempting to be funny on the basis that it's cool and wacky rather than anything thought about that might make it funny. There's no deeper meaning to it, and comedy does need a deeper meaning sometimes. Other than, it's weird, and weird is not good enough. Weird on its own is not funny, and unfortunately that's the approach that's taken most of the time. Anything else is just painful cliches. Oh my god, the men were arguing so much they thought the woman was in charge. Fucking hell, are you 12 years old? Even when it felt like it might have found a funny joke, when the sheriff was the first Nottingham, then Lincoln bit, that had potential, but it gets ruined by being dragged out and then interspersed with Clara's observations, because it's not about having a clever line, it's about exploiting the reaction to create a silly moment. Wacky weirdness is of course the standard Moffat era approach to comedy, and while it didn't really work with Smith, it definitely doesn't work with Capaldi. Capaldi is a very talented comedic actor, but the kind of comedy he excels at is dry black comedy, such as the kind he did as Malcolm Tucker, the role that made him famous and arguably a more iconic role for him than the Doctor. But the hand-flapping wackadoodle commenting on things with a stale hint of irony stuff, he just can't do it. It's not in his wheelhouse. It's dry and painful when he constantly complains about the laughing, from the Outlaws I should add, very definitely not the audience, which just goes on and on, repeated over and over again, and at no point does it feel like Capaldi is comfortable doing it. Again, it's not really a joke, it's just a wacky observation. And even Smith would have struggled with it, but it just dies coming out of Capaldi's mouth. It's just such a bad use of his considerable talents. I hope with all that I've explained why this fails as a comedic piece, because ultimately there are only so many ways to say something isn't funny. So going into a bit more depth of the why as opposed to the what has hopefully let that be more clear. And yes, I'm well aware comedy is very subjective. Perhaps you do find this rip-roaring hilarious. Good for you if you do. I can only speak to my own tastes, and to me this is just anti-humour. So it fails as a comedic piece. Does it succeed as a dramatic piece? No, it doesn't. I'll explain that. Firstly, tone is usually a very big NuWho problem, and in this episode it's ever present as always. There might just be a tiny bit of whiplash between going from the spoon fight to an old man being brutally murdered in front of his daughter to larking around the Outlaw's lair while the Doctor complains about them. It doesn't quite set a coherent tone, to put it mildly. Now, there is a very fine art to managing the tone of stories, and some stories can manage it better than others. Again, listen, the very next episode breaks up our creepy horror scene with a Where's Wally joke, and it does work, because it's about making sure it fits the feel and tone of what you're going for. It's hard, for instance, to take the villain seriously when he's not just surrounded by the wacky hijinks. Indeed, when he's revealing his evil plan to Clara, we cut back to the Doctor and Robin doing the two men hang off together routine, but also have a literal scene he is in has to pop him in with out-of-place jokes. It's double-ended. You make sure the scene you're on has a coherent tone, but also that it fits in with the scenes around it. For instance, Zonkli's scene in City of Death, it's probably Doctor Who's funniest ever scene, at least for me. It's preceded by the simple scene of the Doctor, Romana and Duggan running to the TARDIS, a scene that's growing the tension for the final confrontation, but is not dark or dramatic in itself. We then have the Cleese scene as a moment to break up that tension, providing a little relief, so that when we go into the final scene we go in fresh and ready. There's a fine art to it, and I suppose it is unfair to compare work done by Douglas Adams, a comedic mastermind, to anyone else, but just cutting between exhausted workers being brutally murdered straight to whatever lame joke is being put on this time without thinking about the reaction is going to be from the audience is exactly what this episode just is throughout, and exactly why it doesn't work. It's not to say you can't have both, but you need to think about it, and thinking was not being done here. But the dramatic stuff fails in its own merits too. The Doctor's arc I already touched on, but Clara's makes just as little sense, other than she is perfect and everyone must agree with her about everything, which is the usual fare for her character, but other than that it basically boils down to she really likes Robin Hood for reasons. Wants to meet him, and when she does, she's quite pleased about it, without anything more to it really, other than when he disagrees with her of course, in which case that all gets forgotten and she hates him. There's no deeper look into her character and how she reached these feelings and how they changed her, and why I'm even having to point out the basics of writing character arcs and now nothing is even attempted here. It's just a waste of time even mentioning it at this point. So what about Robin Hood? You know, because this episode is supposed to be a take on the Robin Hood story. Surely it's something to say about his character. Well, no. Have you been listening to anything I've said so far? Do you understand what this episode's theme is? No, of course it doesn't. I'll give the actor, Tom Riley, credit that he's at least trying. Compared to, I'm sorry to say, Capaldi and especially Coleman, who both seem to have checked out throughout this one. He at least imbues Robin with a bit of depth, far more so than the script gives, giving him there's a sense of regret beneath the exterior, about both the world he is in and his own choices. But I'm having to accept that's entirely from the actor, because the script gives him nothing. Any sense of depth, feelings of regret or acceptance are in the few moments where they are present, are just things we're flat out told in dry exposition, which no further explanation of any of those ideas at all. A frequent conceit of modern Robin Hood tales is that he was of noble birth and has taken up this life partially in response to that, and it is mentioned here, but only in one scene where he says exactly what you would expect him to say as a result, and it goes no further. His reaction to finding out about his legendary status in the future is exactly as you'd expect. Shock and disbelief, and then nothing until the end of the episode when there's acceptance. Good, glad we went through that in two short expositional scenes. The stuff with Marion is just bizarre. He wistfully talks about how he's lost her, even though the woman we at the end find out to be Marion is just in a nearby village at the start of the episode. Yeah, she does get captured by the robots, but the way Robin is talking about her, at least it's been years since he's seen her, as opposed to I don't know, half an hour. It not only makes no sense from a plot point of view, it is also once again just thing mentioned in exposition and then barely brought up again, instead of I don't know, informing his choices, perhaps making him more reckless or more bitter and regretful, or at the very least showing how these are feelings he's struggling to bury and how that's affecting him. The thing is with doing Robin Hood, as I spoke about, this is well-trodden ground. Most of us know the cliches, so you have to do something interesting with him or it just becomes dull, and what all this does is lightly hit the well-known beats without exploring any of them. I think it's fair to demand that if you're going to do something so well known and so well trodden, that you do something interesting with it, and this episode just doesn't do that. Well, what about the villain? Well, as I said, he is bizarrely dark as a villain, which is very odd because he's played by Ben Miller, a well-known dry comedian who probably could have turned in a decently funny turn if it was scripted right. Instead, he's meant to be menacing, and no, not at all. Miller's chewing the scenery naturally. It's a more low-key form of scenery chewing, but he's clearly enjoying going for a hammy but dark villain. But the character just doesn't work because the story won't commit to this approach well enough to make him work as a menacing character. Because, well, it's meant to be a comedic piece, then there wouldn't be enough room for shit jokes if we tried to give him more villainous things to do other than generic murdering and taking over the world. And yet, as I said, he's not written as a funny villain, so his humour is just linked to a few small bits, which aren't humorous. This man just veers between bland, ridiculous, and kind of uncomfortable at times, as the script clearly doesn't know what we want, so we veer between different levels of it, often in the same scene. Greedy and corrupt, sadistic and threatening, or goofy and incompetent. It's basically a toss-up from line to line, frankly, and it just feels incoherent. And well, that's before we get to the fact his plan makes no sense, motivations unclear, etc. and so forth. And yes, I get it, the Sheriff of Nottingham's a fairy tale villain in a fairy tale, but just like with Robin, this is such well-trodden ground, you need to do something interesting or it just becomes cliché and uninspired. And well, that's what's happened. Well, I think I've covered the important bases there because frankly there isn't much else to say. The comedy's weak, the drama dull and ineffective. There are frankly only so many ways to say that, and I think diving any deeper would be giving this episode frankly more due than it deserves. So it just leaves me with two questions to answer. Firstly, what does this say about comedy in Doctor Who? Well, that it is a very difficult thing to pull off, and frankly I'm not sure anyone has ever truly done it, at least on TV. Maybe that's because of the inherent nature of the show, or maybe because nobody has quite got the approach right. I'm always in favour of Doctor Who trying new things, so in whatever iteration of it comes next on television, maybe I should just try an episode going balls to the wall, flat jokes and comedy for the whole thing, see if it can work. But this approach, no wacky observations and cool moments nonsense, it never worked, and frankly this might be in its nadir. Secondly, Robin Hood, what mileage is there in exploring his story? Well, I think it's such a well-known tale, that everything is so well-known about it that if you want to explore it, you have to be willing to do something new. And I don't just mean adding robots in. You have to be willing to explore the characters. Not necessarily even Robin Hood himself, but explore how he affects the regulars. The surface level stuff is there, but I don't find anything new about either the Doctor or Clara here. Their generic engagement gives no credence to their non-existent character arcs throughout the episode. We're just playing the Robin Hood greatest hits, and no one wants to see that. It's been done so many times before, not least in a whole TV series as we established went nowhere. I don't necessarily think this was a failure in conception, but ultimately the execution needed just wasn't even close to happening, and I think perhaps a different concept might have reduced this risk. Ultimately, this episode is a failure, and if I had to choose one reason why, is that the elements of an episode aren't enough to make an episode. Robin Hood and comedy, I have my doubts it could work, but it certainly wasn't going to work with those elements just being there, being the sole driver of the story without any further depth. It's an episode that almost relishes in how little there is to it. Final score for this episode, I'm going to give it as 3 out of 10. The directing just about saves it from the 2, by keeping it well paced, preventing it from slipping into tedium and boredom as it so easily could have done, but the script is just such a complete and total mess. It fails at comedy, it has no idea what it wants to do with its premise or characters, and fails to create a compelling plot or narrative. It just ends up as a complete and total disaster, saved only by competence behind the camera, making up for the complete lack of any on the page. A poor effort even by the standards of not terribly good series in Series 8. Best to avoid this one.